After Norway's pain, the focus is not just on the horrific events there, but those which gave rise to it. Is right-wing ideology really making an impression across Europe? And are governments tackling it or inadvertently fueling it? Europe's rise of the right, fact or fiction? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm Kamal Santamaria. The rise of the right. It is an easy sort of phrase to throw around when discussing extremism at that end of the political spectrum. But with an apparent right-wing extremist turning those ideas into terrifying actions in Norway, perhaps it is time to give pause for thought about the true nature of the threat and where it's actually coming from. Now, if you go way back, the phrase right-wing itself actually came from the late 18th century, the French Revolution, where the ultra-royalists sat to the right of the president's chair. Now, though, as you see, it stretches beyond just politics to music there, entire schools of thought, the idea of preserving the status quo in institutions and traditions. Here's the question, though, for Europe. Are issues like Muslim immigrants, globalization, the power of the European Union, the drive towards multiculturalism, actually turning right-wing into a more potent political force, one which, as we see, can turn into violence, and has a sense of lost national identity fed into the success of the populist parties and taken the conversation and the criticism of minorities out into the mainstream? We've got guests from right across Europe today to discuss this with us, starting in Oslo with Anders Giver, who is a political columnist for the Norwegian daily Verdensgang. In Manchester is Matthew Goodwin, an associate fellow at Chatham House, who specialises in extreme right-wing party politics and immigration policy. And rounding out our panel in Brussels is Shannon Foman, policy manager at the European Network Against Racism. She deals with migration, integration and discrimination across Europe. Thank you to all of you for joining us on Inside Story. Lots to talk about. I'm going to start in Oslo with Anders Giver, seeing as that has been the focal point since this story began. Anders, Breivik himself, the man at the centre of all of this, called himself a nationalist. Obviously, he would be the extreme version of nationalism, one which not many people subscribe to. However, what I want to know from you is how strong in Norway is that nationalist political movement?
He is not part of any movement. He is, I think, obviously a lone wolf. He's said that he has some international contacts, but he's obviously worked mostly by himself. He has this manifest that he has posted on the internet that is a mix of a lot of, hatred, anti-immigration, anti-multiculturalism, all the usual stuff that you probably all know, we all know all over Europe. But there was no threads before of violence from this guy. He has been posting anti-immigration, anti-Muslim stuff on websites for those purposes, but he's actually never gave any threats, and he has not had a behavior that has made it in any way possible to foresee this horrific
So in
event.
that case, let's drop him out of the equation then, and just, if you can, give me the political side of things. I'm trying to establish, and we'll look at other countries as well, how much of a presence, not threat, how much of a presence are right-wing politics?
Well, the far right wing, the violent right wing, has been very small. Has never had any real grip on politics in Norway. The Nazi Party before the war wasn't even represented in the parliament until the German occupation put them there. But they have been small, but they have at times been very dangerous. All terror acts in Norwegian political history has been right wing. They have been throwing bombs into parades. They have been executing each other. They have been shooting at people, but these have been very small, very marginal groups, and the vast majority of the Norwegian political landscape has turned their back on them.
Okay, let's broaden things out now, bringing in Matthew Goodwin, who's in Manchester for us. Matthew, I should just give you a comment which someone sent to me on Twitter today and said far right might actually not be a precise enough term, as what we're seeing now is a newer phenomenon than the far right. Is that a fair way to describe the quote-unquote far right in Europe?
Well, I think in the case of Norway, we're not talking about what you might term the traditional far right, that classic neo-Nazi, neo-fascist, white supremacist type movement that we all often associate with the far right. I think in this case we're really specifically talking about hostility toward Muslim communities and Islam. When you read through the manifesto coming out of Norway, this was specifically geared towards Muslim communities and Islam, and by extension the failure of mainstream parties, as Breivik saw it, to deal with that threat.
What about the whole rise of the right? That phrase I kept using before, Matthew, is why, I guess, is the very simple question. Let me simplify it. Why?
When we look at the profiles of voters across Europe, of far-right voters, we can see a couple of core characteristics. Firstly, they're overwhelmingly concerned about and hostile toward rising ethnic diversity in Europe. To be blunt, far-right voters don't like immigration and they want less of it, but they're also profoundly dissatisfied with the mainstream parties, so much so that it's going to be incredibly difficult to bring these voters back into the fold of mainstream politics.
Shannon Foman in Brussels, let's bring you into the conversation. Your views, I'll just give you that same simple question again. Why, in your view, have we seen this rise in different levels across Europe, of course, but generally, broadly speaking, a rise of the right?
Well, generally, every time there's a financial decline, there's always a rise of anti-immigrant sentiment. And right now, the Muslim communities are being targeted as the scapegoats, it seems. And of course, the more often politicians use political rhetoric to be elected, which represents or resembles anti-immigrant and racist and xenophobic sentiment, then it makes it easier for average people, such as this man in Norway, to use these right ideologies to spread a message of contempt, targeting migrants, Muslims, and other general minorities who could easily be excluded because of their voiceless situation as people without citizenship or other important factors that help them use their voice.
So immigration is our central issue here. You pointed out that when economic times are bad, that fuels it. But I mean, you look at a country like Austria, for example, where it's an economically sound country, and yet 2 years ago we saw a big 30% rise, or 30% vote, I should say, for the right-wing parties there. It was just feeding into that anti-immigration feeling.
I imagine it is. It's not happening just in Norway, it's happening in many other countries as well. As far as I know, the Finnish party became popular, the New Finns, because of discontent of the other parties in power, and the center, the main emphasis to try to focus on the farmers, that's the original power behind the New Finns, I believe. The simple person, the simple folk gaining popularity.
Okay, so we've got a few different ideas on the table.
I don't think I answered your question properly.
That's okay, that's okay. We've got a few different ideas on the table from all of you, and I've got a few more here which I want to almost run past you all. And I think we'll go back to Anders in Oslo. He's been waiting there listening. The idea that right-wing ideas are tapping into something in people. I'm not saying that everyone out there is a racist or a bigot or anything like that, but the idea of self-preservation, that we want to look after ourselves and our own, right-wing politics tap into that, and that's another reason perhaps for its popularity.
First, I'd just like to say we are not in a recession. We have this oil economy, which makes us different from most of the rest of Europe. So this is happening actually in good economic times for Norway, which makes it maybe even more scary. What was the other question again? I'm sorry, I lost that.
Oh, it's asking about the idea of, I'm calling it self-preservation, the idea that right-wing politics taps into that idea within us all to a certain degree, that we would want to look after ourselves rather than those who come into our country.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's for the past 10 years, and I guess since 9/11, anti-immigration sentiments has taken a new direction. And you have this, nostalgic look back before we had immigration, the more homogeneous society. We didn't have to lock the doors. We all cared about each other in another way. It's this very pinky idea about the old days. So I guess that plays into it. And I must say, a lot of people are skeptical to immigration without being racists. We have had it's been a difficult issue to talk about because Norwegians we want to be nice, we want to be political correct, we don't want to hurt anybody. So it's been bubbling under, and I think it has come to the surface after a long time. But I mean, what this guy did has really nothing to do with any political party or anything. He's a lone wolf. What I'm scared of is that he might inspire other people all over Europe and America.
Matthew Goodwin, is it also the idea that, and this is a quote I've seen from an analyst I read online who said it's becoming politically acceptable to take extreme positions, and that therefore the rhetoric, the talk is out there. It's not good rhetoric, but people get used to the idea of it being spoken about more.
Well, I think we've certainly seen the emergence of a more favourable climate for right-wing parties and ideas and their followers. We've seen, for example, mainstream political leaders in Europe now denounce multiculturalism as a failure, whether David Cameron, Sarkozy or Angela Merkel. We've seen a sharp turn to the right in terms of our policies toward immigration and integration, and we've seen a heavy, often stigmatizing focus on Muslim communities who have often been denounced as terrorists. And I think that overall, when we look at this picture and we just put that recession and the financial crisis to one side, because it isn't just simply financial crisis and we have extremism, but when we look at these trends across Europe, they point overwhelmingly to the conclusion that there's emerged a very favourable terrain for right-wing movements, groups and parties.
Now, Matthew has mentioned David Cameron there, and I'm glad you did because I wanted to bring this up, and you used the term favourable climate. A couple of quotes to bring you now from a couple of very big European leaders. Start with David Cameron, who said this: under the doctrine of state multiculturalism, we have encouraged different cultures to live separate lives apart from each other and the mainstream. He went on to say we've even tolerated these segregated communities, behaving in ways that run counter to our values. That was earlier this year. Before that, Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, October 2010, far more frank, actually. She said the tendency had been to say, let's adopt the multicultural concept and live happily side by side and be happy to be living with each other. But this concept has failed, and failed utterly. Very strong words there from Angela Merkel. Shannon Foman, if I come to you there in Brussels, is what these leaders saying? Well, let's break it down first. Let's look at the idea that actually what they're saying is almost a measured sort of honest response. They're just being honest about the fact that immigration brings these issues.
Now, the problem is, in my opinion, is that they're talking about two different things. At the one time, they're talking about integration, but really what they mean is assimilation, which means that the migrants themselves have to adopt all of the norms of the host society and assimilate. They become Germans or they become Finns. And what's missing in this is the element of refugee or migrant incorporation, which actually supports the migrants in their attempt to integrate, and it's a two-way process. And that seems to be lacking in a lot of these situations. We talk about the anti-immigrant sentiment and the increasingly anti-immigrant legislation that's being passed. It's not conducive to an equal, participative, inclusive society.
So should politicians
and that's one of the biggest problems, in my opinion.
Should politicians be more careful when they say things like that? As I said, Angela Merkel was very, very upfront, and even David Cameron, when you read the whole text, was very upfront as well about this. Should they be more careful in the knowledge that these sorts of things can be seized upon by, for example, a more right-wing group?
Of course. Of course, they need to be more careful. But the problem is too often they rely on these types of political statements to gain votes. And it's wrong, it's unfair, and it's inaccurate, because the reality is that Europe needs migrants. We've got an increasingly aging society, lack of workers, and they need to realize that workers are taking on jobs, migrants, are taking on jobs that normal Europeans don't want to take. Normal meaning people with native citizenship. And so what that means is that the migrants are coming, taking on positions that the average citizen does not want to take, and they're creating jobs for Europe, because in their taking on these low-skilled positions, there's always going to be a boss who usually has native citizenship. So the reality is that Europe needs migrants, and that it makes little sense to use political rhetoric to target migrants, and it makes even less sense to target a Muslim community